Hey everybody, Nick Espinoza, your chief security fanatic here. Don't forget to subscribe. And this week's deep dive is on AI data centers in space. Yes, these are coming probably sooner than later in the grand scheme of things, and we really need to discuss this. Now, we all know that we have basically longitudinal issues with data center expansion here, basically on Earth. And the year 2025 has been the year of a lot of different things: changes in governments, political strife, ongoing wars and escalations towards that, and so much more. But regardless of the strife and issues, the rapid expansion of artificial intelligence is arguably one of the most important, celebrated, and worrisome things that humanity is facing today. And so let's break this down. First, we're going to discuss the news here that recently broke. David Chu of People had a really good synopsis of a much longer Wall Street Journal article, but then we're going to dive into basically the pros and cons of orbiting data centers, as well as who this both benefits and threatens. And finally, if this is actually feasible in the short and long terms. What does it look like in the next 5 years and 10 years and 15 plus years? Let's dive in, because if you didn't know, Jeff Bezos and Elon Musk, they're the founders of the private space travel companies Blue Origin and SpaceX respectively. They're working on deploying AI data centers in orbit. This is according, again, to the Wall Street Journal reporting. So a source told the journal that Bezos's Blue Origin team has been working on the technology for data centers for over a year. Basically data centers in space. Other sources talking to the Wall Street Journal said that SpaceX is planning to launch an upgraded version of its Starlink satellites to provide AI computing payloads as well. So, the US as well as the world, but let's stick with the US for a second here, because both Bezos and Musk's companies are located in the United States. They're going through an AI boom at the moment. 4,000 data centers in the US are either in operation or currently under construction, not to mention thousands of data centers in other countries as well. And this is essentially where we're going. On top of this, according to management consulting firm McKinsey, data centers are expected to spend $6.7 trillion US globally by 2030 in order to keep up with the computing power needs that artificial intelligence is ever consuming. So, residents in the United States are facing increased pricing for electricity. That's thanks in part to the presence of data centers, nearby. In other words, if you're pooling all the energy in an area, you might have 100 households and the data center is doing 10 times that, and therefore it's raising the prices on those 100 households. So a 2024 report from the U.S. Department of Energy found that data centers used approximately 4.4% of total U.S. electricity in 2023, but they are expected to consume anywhere from 6.7 to 12% of all U.S. electricity in basically 2 years from now in 2028. This is a massively, rapidly expanding situation here with these data centers and the need to consume power. And so let's talk about putting data centers in space, because quite frankly, I think there are pros and there are cons. And so let's talk about the strategic advantages of this. First, and it's very obvious, is cooling efficiency and thermal management, right? The clear pro here is that space has a near infinite thermal sink compared to what is offered here on Earth. So AI data centers, especially GPU accelerator clusters, are basically constrained heavily by heat dissipation on the planet. But in orbit, basically cooling via radiation or radiative cooling is way more efficient. So with proper radiator designs, waste heat can be managed with basically less energy, lower operating costs, all those things. And there's also no water consumption, which is a huge problem, and it solves that water intensity issue that makes AI facilities really politically controversial. We saw studies before that, like a bottle of water that you go buy for like $1 at your local supermarket is basically the cost of a single AI prompt, and we're seeing tens of thousands of prompts a second around the world on ChatGPT, Gemini, et cetera, combined, which adds to billions of prompts, basically every year. So it's a massive water drain, but putting it in space it's not an issue, solves that problem. On top of it, another big point is the security side, right? It's physical isolation. try breaking into a data center that is orbiting the planet, right? So your physical attack surface is virtually nil. Space-based infrastructure is almost completely immune to theft, physical sabotage, and local natural disasters. High-value AI training systems, models, weights, data, stuff like that can be stored in a hard-to-reach jurisdictional environment, creating kind of like a sovereign cloud outside or above any kind of nation state level. So this could serve defense, intelligence, high sensitivity commercial workloads, where physical security is of paramount importance. I mean, literally to break into this thing, not destroy it, but like break into this thing, you have to basically get your butt on a shuttle, become an astronaut, and then get into this thing. I mean, that's not easy to do as opposed to just driving to the data center, which is what we can do right now if we know where they are. On top of it, another pro is edge connectivity, right? For global inference delivery. Global inference workloads are incredibly important in the AI world. So using constellations like Starlink or Kuiper up there, orbital data centers could broadcast artificial intelligence globally. And so those AI workloads, especially inference workloads, can be placed closer to global end units, which would reduce latency in underserved regions. So if you're sitting in an urban area like Chicago or Toronto or London or something like that, you really don't have much latency because you have a lot of infrastructure around you. But if you're in the middle of nowhere, satellite is pretty much the best way to get to you in terms of last mile and capability to actually connect. So this could enable global digital services uncoupled from terrestrial infrastructure, or geopolitics just in general as well. A lot of companies have tried this. Facebook, aka Meta, tried to put a internet-based satellite over Africa to basically serve a lot of regions that don't have that there. It blew up on the launch pad. Thank you, SpaceX, for that one. But these are huge things. Another pro is energy independence. Solar energy in orbit is extremely stable and very high yield compared to here on Earth. Space receives about 3 times more solar radiation than the Earth's surface. And so this enables carbon-free continuous power for AI workloads and potentially lowers lifetime energy costs as well. Not to mention another pro could be massive scalability in an actual vacuum, right? There's no land rights, no zoning boards, no water constraints, no neighborhoods opposed to basically like, oh, the data center is going to hog all of our power and raise our prices. We don't have any of those issues if we are in space, right? Earth is increasingly resistant to hyperscale data center expansion due to water, electricity, and environmental impact. And so space bypasses a lot of the political bottlenecks that, quite frankly, we just see. So that is absolutely a benefit. And then there is a pro as well in data sovereignty. There's ambiguity here. Now that's a feature for some. It's also a con, and we'll talk about that. But this could be a pro for certain corporate or government strategies as well. Data stored in orbit could reside out of traditional legal jurisdictions. So it could allow for extremely sensitive research and development, like weapons-related modeling. This could be proprietary model training without national regulatory encumbrances. There are benefits that basically says, well, who owns space? What jurisdiction am I in if my data center is literally not within a border? And so there is going to be benefit to that. That is going to be a pro, but we'll talk about the con of that as well. And let's talk about those cons because there is, quite frankly, a lot of them as well. Now, I think the strategic disadvantages here, and I think the first one that I can think of is the cost alone for things like launch, deployment, and maintenance are going to be absolutely insane. So maintaining infrastructure in orbit is vastly more expensive on Earth. You've got a server in a data center that blows. You can stick it in a car and drive it to the data center and slap it in. Can't do that when it's orbiting the planet, right? So launching the mass that is a data center is going to be costly, even with things like reusable rockets, something that SpaceX and Blue Origin, have been working very heavily on. On top of this, hardware replacement cycles in AI compute are measured in months, not years. We're constantly upgrading, constantly building new performance. Look at NVIDIA. They're constantly coming out with new, more aggressive chips, basically to make AI more efficient for compute. And so you've got a data center that's floating up there for months, not years, and it's going to be basically becoming obsolete. Space servicing missions are rare, they're dangerous, they're very expensive, and even one failed module could cost basically potentially tens of millions to hundreds of millions of dollars just to fix. So if something goes wrong, that's a huge issue. On top of it, we do have latency issues for things like AI training, which is acceptable only for some kind of inference workload. So that is a big con because space introduces unavoidable physics-driven latency. For Earth to orbit communication, latency is roughly 440 to 100 milliseconds or so, depending on altitude in space. And so for distributed AI training, like large language models, deep learning, those kinds of things, the efficiency is essentially destroyed because of the latency. So meaningful training is then kind of unrealistic unless bulk data is pre-launched or entire distributed clusters exist in orbit. Inference workloads can tolerate latency penalties, but multi-node trading can't for the most part. And so that is a very bad thing. That's a very difficult thing to overcome. This is not the same as like, oh, you're out in the bush in Australia or Africa or somewhere, and your satellite is giving you internet and connectivity. This requires a lot of speed, performance, and capability, and that's something that's difficult to achieve in space. On top of it, another big con here, I think, is the vulnerabilities to things like space weather and orbital hazards. We have space weather. If you didn't know, space is a hostile environment. It really is. We can't breathe up there, but it's hostile. Solar flares, coronal mass ejections, radiation, micrometeorites, debris, temperature extremes, all of this threatens basically a floating data center in orbit. It threatens uptime. Severe radiation can degrade GPU and TPU chips. Redundant shielding to basically protect against a lot of this adds weight, it adds cost, it adds complexity. These are challenges that would need to basically be overcome if this is going to be successful. And in the long run, it probably will be, but it's going to cost. On top of it, the con is also the jurisdictional, legal, and sovereignty conflicts. I mentioned it as a pro. It's a pro for some, it's a con for others, because space-based data centers are going to trigger international disputes. I think they are. I've been thinking about this as I've been putting this together, but which nation has legal authority over an orbital AI platform, right? Who owns the compute? Who regulates that? Whose privacy laws apply? Is it GDPR if it's orbiting over Europe? Is it the United States Cloud Act if it's sitting over the continental United States? Nobody? Like we don't know. This could be basically like a data haven, but it could also lead to a regulatory backlash. Militaries could view these platforms as dual-use assets, which then increases geopolitical tensions. We already have spy satellites up there that nobody's a fan of. I did an interview with a space law expert about it. I want to say it was like a year or so ago. It was a fascinating conversation. You can go find that on my YouTube channel. But law in space is kind of wild. If you didn't know, SpaceX being, or Blue Origin being a US-based company, if they accidentally crash into a Chinese satellite, technically, that could be a declaration of war. Like that's how crazy it is in space law right now, right? On top of it, another con is we have limited repairability, short product life cycles. I mentioned this somewhat before, but AI hardware has to be replaced frequently due to rapid generational obsolescence. Launching new GPUs every 18 to 24 months is essentially unsustainable right now. Orbital compute may also become basically obsolete before the return on investment is actually achieved. In other words, these companies are pouring money into this, but they're not getting the actual ROI, so they continue to pour money into this to continue to make it bigger, better, more expansive, but more costly. And we're constantly flipping these things. Look at the turnover of hardware compute in a data center that's sitting here on Earth. It's easy to drive to it. It's easy to upgrade these things, but it's an enormous task to keep these things up to date as new power is needed and comes out. On top of it, we have other detractors. A big con with space debris. There's also environmental opposition to this. Large orbital infrastructure increases collision risks, and so it proliferates debris. If it crashes into something, basically, and shatters things everywhere, well, now we've got a whole bunch of floating debris, orbiting the Earth. We already have a lot of that already due to other things that are up there, satellites burning out, other crashes, all this kind of stuff. Environmental groups could oppose this because it might be turning Earth's orbit into a commercial data center ring that, here we are, debris that interferes with other types of space travel. Legal liabilities for collisions and debris kind of remain pretty much unclear at this point. And on top of it, another big con, I think, is dual use use abuse, right? Space AI compute may be viewed inherently as escalatory, right? It could support military-grade simulations, autonomous weapons, research and development, intelligence analytics. And so rivals, think US versus China, China versus US, rivals may attempt to target or disable these systems, which could potentially militarize space even more than it is. The United States recently spun up Space Force. Other major nations are starting to basically build space militaries as well. This is a huge problem. And so with the pros and the cons here, who benefits from this? Who's actually threatened here? And as I'm thinking this through, I think the beneficiaries are a few different people, or a few different entities, if you will. So I think the beneficiaries are space launch companies, right? SpaceX, Blue Origin, et cetera, et cetera. You're going to have data center companies, I think, that are going to want to get on board with this, or new data center companies that are going to see this as a potential pro to put this in space. Governments seeking hardened or sovereign compute for defense are absolutely beneficiaries to something like this. Not to mention hyperscalers needing new compute capacity without like the political resistance they're getting here due to energy, water consumption, all these kinds of things. AI companies, I think, also are beneficiaries. They could view orbital sovereign enclaves as a regulatory escape. In other words, I don't have to be beholden to the US government or, the Canadians or the Russians or EU. Think about your large area countries in the world where these satellites would be orbiting, those kinds of things. On top of it, we have basically threatened parties as well, those that are not going to be beneficiaries of this. So terrestrial data center operators, if they're not getting on board with this kind of stuff, that potentially threatens their businesses. Nobody's really losing sleep over that, but that is the truth. On top of it, privacy regulators and governments concerned about enforcement in orbit, they're getting excluded. We don't have laws. Like right now in the United States, trying to create a law about orbiting platforms in space when you've got a Congress that can't even get together and vote on what to have for lunch, that I don't think is going to happen. And so that benefits the private companies that would be launching these into orbit. On top of it, we've got competitor nations that see basically orbital compute as a strategic threat. So if China wants to start going after data centers from SpaceX and Blue Origin, does the United States get involved in that? Does the United States go after Chinese orbiting platforms? And on and on and on. Environmental and space degree policy communities are going to have issues with this as well, due to all of the debris situation that we already have, and this would create more. Imagine a micrometeorite hitting one of these things and it breaks into 500 pieces, and now it's floating around, bumping into things, eventually changing the debris patterns in space. And we have windows of debris patterns that we launch through to ensure, safety of launches. So that's a big issue as well. And so I want to wrap this up by simply asking, is this feasible? Given the pros, given the cons, given the push that basically two of the biggest players in private space, SpaceX and Blue Origin, are pushing towards, can we do this? So let's talk about, now to the next 5 years, 2031. Can we actually do this, right? Orbit-based, inference nodes are plausible. The training really isn't. In the near term, right? So we could expect small pilots, test beds, experiments, but I don't think large-scale clusters are coming in the next 5 years or so. They've only been working on this for about a year, but I do think this is coming. The next 5 to 15 years, I think, are going to be, more important here in terms of action, because it is definitely feasible to do this, but it's an if. And it's if robotics and in-orbit manufacturing and low-cost launch capability actually mature themselves. In other words, the robots perfect themselves. In-orbit manufacturing, meaning we're bringing up the materials and then we can have the robots manufacture the data center, and therefore the robots could also upgrade the data centers in the long term, and the cost of an actual launch becomes much less expensive due to, let's say, innovation or streamlining of that capability. I think that's where we're going to start to see some action here. But the regulatory and geopolitical barriers, I think, are going to increase as a result of that. And so we are going to start seeing governments take a real eye to this and say, this isn't good, especially if, the US military, the Chinese military, whatever, are now developing autonomous weapons in AI computing data centers that are orbiting our respective countries, right? So that is, I think, a big potential issue. In the long term, if we're talking 15 years plus, and I think a truly orbital cloud is possible. But I think there are a lot of conditions that need to be met in order for this to happen. So a fully robotic service and maintenance system has to be in place. I don't think you can do this without this. Humans are not going to be living in space long term just to manage a data center, right? And then we have to have reliable in-orbit chip replacement, or basically fabrication systems that can make the chips. In other words, we can send the schematics and they'll have the raw materials to manufacture them, and then the robots can upgrade the compute in these platforms. That is, I think, one of the most important aspects of this. On top of it, we're probably at that point going to see international governance frameworks. We're going to see, I think, much different changes in government policy as a result of this. And also, the leadership that we have right now around the world in 15 years most likely is not going to be the leadership that we're going to have, in 15 years, right? I mean, if you look at it, presidents have a max of 8 years. President Trump right now is in his 80s. In 15 years, he's not going to be president. Not to mention President Xi in China is not going to be president there. Not to mention a lot of the leaders in Europe and Canada and all of this. We're going to see a lot of turnover, which means we're going to see a lot of potential political machinations or more regulations getting put around this as it becomes more and more feasible. On top of it, we're going to have, I would hope, reduced debris risk with advancements in technologies to deflect things like, or absorb things like micrometeorites, so it's not going to spin off and shatter into a million pieces and cause that debris issue that we are seeing. Satellites now are designed to burn up in orbit when they start decaying, and we might have some kind of technology that aligns with that. So there's a lot that goes into this. I think that this is something that we are going to see in our lifetimes. I don't think it's going to be as effective as terrestrial data centers, but the terrestrial data centers, I think, will also turn robotic. So they'll have the fab capabilities, and the robots will continuously upgrade these as we continuously improve our processing power, our compute power, our capability. And by virtue of that, it's going to be a real race. Efficiency in energy, I think, is coming, providing the governments allow efficiency to really move forward and don't strangle it in some kind of regulation to allow old styles of energy, that are less efficient or less capable, maintain the day. Because quite frankly, we're going to need to advance energy efficiency as well. And maybe it is, sinking things like solar panels in space to collect better radiation, from the sun that could potentially, augment power here on Earth. I mean, there's a lot of different things that could happen here. So at the end of the day, this is going to be a big one. And we're going to see what happens here, right? We don't know essentially where this is going to go, but when you've got a big push and you've got a lot of money, we're talking about two of the most wealthiest people on the planet and two of the largest corporations or corporate ecosystems on the planet pushing this, we're going to see this come to fruition. We're just going to see how effective it is. And quite frankly, I think it's going to take years and years and years to get there, but I think we're going to start. And so that is your deep dive of the week. And please like, share, follow me here on Facebook and Twitter at NickAESP. And please feel free to subscribe to me at YouTube as well. And as always, stay safe, stay online, and please, please, please attempt to stay private, informed, and secure. Take care.